The train groaned to a halt, its sigh of steam a final, weary exhalation against the immense, indifferent sky. Clara Bishop stepped down onto the splintered platform, her worn leather valise a meager anchor in the vast, dust-choked expanse of redemption. The town was less a settlement and more a scar upon the land, a handful of weathered buildings clinging to a dirt track that vanished into the pale horizon. Heat shimmered from the ground, distorting the world into a wavering, uncertain mirage. There was no one waiting for her. No Mr. Abernathy, the man whose letters had been so full of prosperous promises and gentle words, the man for whom she had crossed a continent. The station master, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with disappointment, merely grunted when she asked, pointing a nicotine-stained finger toward the sheriff's office before retreating into the shade of his station. A knot of cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, tightened in Clara's stomach. It was the same feeling she'd had when the bank took the farm, when her father's grave was covered by the first snow. It was the feeling of being utterly and irrevocably alone. Her gaze swept the desolate scene, landing on a heap of what looked like discarded rags at the far end of the freight platform, tucked behind a stack of barrels. The sheriff, a portly man named Elias Thorne, listened to her story with a practiced air of sympathy that did not reach his eyes. He confirmed what her gut already knew. Mr. Abernathy had died of lung fever 2 weeks prior. The small cabin at the edge of town, the one promised to her, was hers to use for a month, a small gesture of pity from the town council. After that, she was on her own. "A woman alone has a hard time of it here, ma'am," he stated, not as a warning, but as a simple, unadorned fact. "Best you take the next train east." His words were a dismissal, a final closing of a door she hadn't even had the chance to open. Despair, sharp and visceral, threatened to buckle her knees. She had sold the last of her mother's jewelry for the ticket west. There was no east to return to. There was nothing but this scorched earth and the hollow promise of a dead man. As she stepped back out into the punishing sunlight, her world reduced to the single street of this forsaken town, her eyes were drawn again to the freight platform. The pile of rags had moved. A hand, caked in dirt and dried blood, had emerged, twitching feebly. The townspeople, few as they were, gave the platform a wide berth, their faces hard and unforgiving, gazes averted as if the sight were an offense. Curiosity, or perhaps a deeper, more desperate kinship with the abandoned, pulled Clara closer. It was a man. He lay sprawled on the hot, greasy planks, his breathing a shallow, rasping shudder. His clothes were fine once, a tailored coat now ripped and stained, good leather boots scuffed beyond recognition. A dark, angry wound wept through his shirt at his side, and a gash on his forehead was matted with blood and hair. His face, half hidden in shadow, was gaunt, his lips cracked and pale. He was dying. He was being left to die, in plain sight, under the same merciless sun that beat down on her own shattered hopes. She looked around at the faces in the windows, the men leaning against the general store. No one moved. No one cared. It was a cruelty so profound, so casual, it stole her breath. This was redemption, a place where a man could be discarded like so much refuse. The sheriff emerged from his office, saw where she was headed, and called out, "Leave it be, ma'am. He's trouble. Best not to get involved." His voice held that same dispassionate finality. But Clara had been involved with trouble her entire life. She had fought it, been beaten by it, and buried its victims. To walk away now felt like a betrayal not of this stranger, but of some last, flickering ember of defiance within herself. If she was to be broken, it would not be because she had become as hard and pitiless as this place. Kneeling beside him, she felt the faint, fluttering heat of his breath against her hand. In that moment, a choice was made. A silent, reckless vow. She would not let him die. The decision, once made, settled in her bones like iron. The sheriff watched, his expression a mixture of pity and annoyance, as Clara struggled with the dead weight of the unconscious man. He offered no help. No one did. She was a curiosity, a fool playing out a scene for the town's languid entertainment. The man was taller than her, and though gaunt from his ordeal, his frame was solid muscle and bone. Getting him to his feet was an impossibility. Her mind, sharpened by a lifetime of practical hardship, began to work the problem. She unbuckled his gun belt, the heavy pistol and cartridges clattering to the platform. Then, with grunts of exertion that tore at her throat, she managed to roll him onto his back. He groaned, a low, animal sound of pure agony, and his eyes flickered open for a moment. They were startlingly clear blue, clouded with pain and confusion, but they saw her. For a fleeting second, there was a flicker of something, surprise perhaps, before they slid shut again. That brief connection, the silent acknowledgement of her presence, solidified her resolve. She would not be deterred. She looped the leather gun belt under his arms, creating a harness. Then, turning her back to him, she leaned into the makeshift strap, her heels digging into the splintery wood. He was a stone, an anchor, and the effort was immense. Every muscle in her back and legs screamed in protest. Dust and grit coated her tongue, and sweat stung her eyes, blurring the dusty street into a watercolor of browns and grays. Inch by painstaking inch, she dragged him. The sound was gruesome. The scuff of his boots, the soft, terrible drag of his body across the platform, and then into the thick dust of the street. The stares of the townspeople were like physical blows against her back. She heard a woman's sharp, derisive laugh from the porch of the saloon. She saw men shake their heads in a kind of weary disgust. Their judgment was a tangible thing, a wall of contempt she had to push through with every step. They saw a foolish woman meddling where she shouldn't, wasting her pity on a man already marked for the grave. They did not see the truth, that this act of salvation was as much for herself as for him. It was a rebellion against the crushing indifference that had greeted her, a refusal to let her own spirit be extinguished by the town's apathy. If she let this man die, a part of her would die with him. The small, furnished cabin Mr. Abernathy had described in his letters was at the very edge of town, little more than a shack against the encroaching wilderness. The distance felt like miles. Her lungs burned, her vision swam, but she did not stop. She focused on the rhythm of it. Pull, step, breathe. Pull, step, breathe. The world narrowed to this singular, grueling task. Finally, she reached the cabin's dilapidated porch. The final hurdle of 3 small steps seemed like a mountain. She collapsed for a moment, her breath coming in ragged sobs, her body trembling with exhaustion. The man lay still in the dirt behind her. For a terrifying moment, she thought he had died during the journey, that her monumental effort had been for nothing. She crawled back to him, pressing her fingers against his neck. The pulse was still there, a faint, thready beat, a fragile drum signaling a life that refused to surrender. Renewed by that small sign, she found a last reservoir of strength. Using the porch post for leverage, she heaved and wrestled him up the steps and through the doorway, his body thudding onto the rough-hewn floorboards. The door swung shut behind them, closing out the accusing sun and the judgmental eyes of redemption. Inside, the air was stale and close, thick with the scent of pine and disuse. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light from a grimy window. Clara leaned against the closed door, her body screaming, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had done it. She had dragged a dying man from the jaws of public apathy and into this small, private space. Now, staring down at his still form, the true weight of her decision began to sink in. She had not just saved a life, she had claimed it. And now, she had no idea what to do with it. The hours that followed bled into a desperate, silent vigil. Clara's first task was to get him off the floor. She managed to drag him to the narrow cot in the corner, the only bed in the one-room cabin. The straw-stuffed mattress rustled and sagged under his weight. With fumbling hands, she lit the small kerosene lamp, its flickering golden light pushing back the encroaching shadows of dusk and casting their stark tableau into relief. The still figure on the bed, and the weary woman standing over him. She worked with a grim, methodical focus born of necessity. On the farm, She had tended to sick animals and ailing family members. Death and injury were familiar, if unwelcome, companions. She stoked the embers in the small cast-iron stove, adding precious pieces of kindling until a small, steady fire took hold. Water was her most immediate need. The well outside was deep, the bucket heavy, and each trip left her more breathless than the last. She set a pot to boil, the bubbling sound a small comfort in the oppressive silence. Then came the wounds. Using a pair of scissors from her sewing kit, she carefully cut away the fabric of his shirt. The wound in his side was worse than she had feared. It was deep, inflamed around the edges, encrusted with dirt and dried blood. The gash on his forehead was cleaner but required delicate attention. She tore strips from one of her own clean petticoats, her small store of personal belongings already being sacrificed to this stranger. As she cleaned the wounds with hot water and a sliver of harsh soap, the man drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness. He would murmur unintelligible words, his body tensing with spasms of pain. His skin was hot to the touch, the fever a raging fire within him. Clara repeatedly bathed his face and chest with cool cloths, trying to hold the heat from his body. The intimacy of the act was not lost on her. She was touching a complete stranger with a tenderness she had reserved for family, her hands tracing the hard lines of a life she knew nothing about. She saw old scars crisscrossing his torso, faint white lines that spoke of past violence. His hands, though filthy, were not the hands of a common drifter. They were strong, calloused, but with long fingers that suggested a life beyond simple labor. Who was this man? What trouble had brought him to be left for dead on a freight platform? The sheriff's words echoed in her mind. He's trouble. As the night wore on, the cabin became her entire world. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls. The fire in the stove became a living thing, a small heart of warmth and light she had attended constantly. It was a battle on two fronts, the fever consuming the man and the vast, dark emptiness that lay just outside the door. In those long, dark hours, her own past rose up to meet her. She saw her father's face, etched with worry over the failing crops. She felt the rough calico of her mother's dress, smelled the bread she used to bake. She remembered the clipped, impersonal voice of the banker explaining why they had to leave the land their family had worked for generations. Her journey west had been a desperate flight from that grief, a search for a place where she could plant new roots, however shallow. She had pinned all her hopes on Mr. Abernathy's letters, on the promise of shared life, a partnership. Now that hope was ash, and she was here in a borrowed cabin, fighting for the life of a man who might be a saint or a devil. Was this her penance? Or was it, in some strange way, her purpose? She didn't know. All she knew was the rhythm of her task. Dip the cloth, wipe his brow, check the fire, listen to his breathing. As dawn approached, casting a pale, gray light through the window, the man's fever seemed to break. His breathing deepened, losing its ragged edge. The violent heat began to recede from his skin. Clara, hollowed out by exhaustion, slumped into the single wooden chair beside the cot. She watched his chest rise and fall in a steady, life-affirming rhythm. She had won. For now, the man would live. And with that realization came a new, more complicated fear. What would happen when he woke up? He woke 2 days later, not with a start, but with a slow, quiet drifting into awareness. One moment his eyes were closed, the next they were open, fixed on the rough timber ceiling of the cabin. They were the same clear blue she remembered, but the pain and confusion had been replaced by a sharp, assessing intelligence. He blinked slowly, his gaze traveling from the ceiling to the stone hearth, to the bucket of water by the door, and finally, to her. Clara was sitting in the chair, mending a tear in her dress, the needle moving with practiced efficiency. She felt his stare before she looked up, a sudden weight of attention in the small room. Their eyes met across the space. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. He tried to push himself up, a grimace of pain flashing across his face as the movement pulled at his bandaged side. "Don't," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was the first word she had spoken to him directly. He settled back against the thin pillow, his gaze never leaving her. "Where?" he began, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "Redemption," she answered simply. "My cabin." He seemed to process this, his brow furrowed. "The platform," he rasped, more a statement than a question. She just nodded, her needle pausing in its work. She offered no grand explanation, no litany of her efforts. The simple facts were enough. He was there. Now he was here. A long silence followed. He was watching her, studying her face, her hands, the neat stitches she was making. It wasn't a threatening gaze, but an intensely curious one, as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. Finally, he spoke again, his voice a little stronger. "Why?" It was the question that hung between them, the one the whole town had asked with their scornful eyes. Why would she, a lone woman with nothing, risk what little she had for a nameless, dying man? Clara set her sewing aside. She looked at him, at the gaunt lines of his face, the vulnerability that even his stoic expression could not entirely conceal. She thought of the cold indifference of the town, of the sheriff's casual dismissal. She thought of being left alone on that platform, with all her hopes turned to dust. Her answer, when it came, was as simple and unadorned as her first. Because no one else would, the honesty of her words seemed to land with a quiet force. He did not reply, but something in his expression shifted. The sharp assessment softened, replaced by a deep, weary understanding. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the small exchange had exhausted him. When he opened them again, he said, "Silas." "My name is Silas Mercer, Clara Bishop," she replied. And with that simple exchange of names, the fragile truce of caregiver and patient began to transform into something else, something tentative and unnamed, built on a shared foundation of desperation and a single, inexplicable act of kindness. Over the next week, a quiet routine established itself within the four walls of the cabin. Silas healed slowly, his body's stubborn refusal to quit mirroring a quiet determination she was beginning to recognize in his character. Clara tended to him with a detached efficiency that belied the fierce protectiveness she felt. She made thin broths and watery oatmeal, the only sustenance their meager supplies and his weak stomach could handle. She changed his bandages, her touch gentle but professional, never lingering. They spoke little. The silence in the cabin was not empty, but filled with observation. She watched him as he slept, noting the way his hand would clench, as if gripping a weapon or a memory. He watched her as she moved about the small space, her actions economical and purposeful, whether she was sweeping the floor, kneading a small lump of dough for flatbread, or staring out the window at the hostile landscape. The trust between them grew not from words, but from actions. He never questioned her, never demanded more than she offered. He accepted the food, the water, the clean dressings with a quiet nod of thanks that seemed to carry more weight than a flowery speech. She, in turn, never pressed him for the story of how he came to be wounded and left for dead. She understood that some stories could only be told when the teller was ready, and that pressing for them was a form of violence in itself. One afternoon, as he sat propped against the wall, strong enough now to be out of the cot for short periods, he broke the silence. "You're not from here." It was a statement, not a question. "No," she said, her back to him as she washed their 2 tin plates in a basin of water. "I came from Pennsylvania. My family had a farm." She didn't elaborate, but the words hung in the air, thick with the ghosts of green fields and rolling hills, a stark contrast to the parched land outside. "My father passed. The farm, it didn't survive him." Silas was quiet for a long time, and she thought the conversation was over. Then he said, his voice low, "I had a ranch in a Montana territory, north of the Cinnabar." He spoke of it with a kind of reverence, his words painting a picture of wide-open grasslands, of snow-capped mountains, and the smell of pine after a rain. He didn't speak of people, only of the land, the sky, and the horses. He described a chestnut stallion with a white blaze, a horse so smart it could open gates on its own. As he spoke, A different man emerged from the broken figure she had rescued. She saw a glimpse of the man he had been, proud, capable, and deeply connected to his world. A man who had loved something and lost it. In that, they were the same. The sharing of these small, broken pieces of their past was like laying stones to build a bridge across the chasm of their silence. It was a fragile structure, but it was a start. The next day, Silas was able to stand and walk a few halting steps across the cabin. His strength was returning, and with it, a restlessness. He was a man accustomed to open spaces, and the small cabin was beginning to feel like a cage. He started to help with small tasks, his movements slow and deliberate. He would chop kindling for the stove, his brow furrowed in concentration, his bandaged side a constant, painful reminder of his limitations. He would sit on the porch step in the evening, watching the sun bleed across the horizon, his expression unreadable. Clara found herself watching him, her initial fear and pity evolving into a complex mixture of respect and a deep, unsettling curiosity. She was aware of him in a way that had nothing to do with being his nurse. She was aware of his quiet strength, the way his presence filled the small cabin, the unspoken gravity he carried. The line between them, once so clear, was beginning to blur. She was no longer just his rescuer. He was no longer just her patient. They were two solitary people, adrift in a harsh world, who had found a temporary, precarious harbor in each other's company. The fragile peace of their seclusion was not destined to last. The town of redemption, and the world beyond it, began to press in on their small sanctuary. The first intrusion was Sheriff Thorne. He appeared at her door one afternoon, his hat in his hand, his face wearing a mask of paternal concern that Clara no longer trusted. His eyes flickered past her to where Silas sat at the small table, his expression hardening almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am," the sheriff began, his voice low, "just checking to see you're faring all right. Your month is nearly up." The reminder was a clear threat. "Your charity has a deadline." "And you," he said, his gaze shifting fully to Silas. "You look to be mending." "The name Mercer. It's a big name up north." "A rich name." Silas said nothing, his face a granite slab of indifference. But Clara saw the subtle tightening of his jaw. "Folks are asking questions," Thorne continued, his tone conversational but edged with steel. "Questions about a dispute, about an inheritance, about two brothers looking for a third." He let the words hang in the air before tipping his hat. "Just be mindful, that's all. Trouble has a way of finding people. Even out here, the sheriff's visit left a chill in the cabin that the fire could not dispel. The unspoken threat was now out in the open, given shape and voice. That evening, Silas finally told her. He sat on the edge of the cot, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his past pressing down on him. "My father built one of the biggest cattle operations in the territory," he began, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "When he died, he left it to the three of us. Me and my two older brothers, Marcus and Caleb." He described his brothers as men who saw the land not as a living thing, but as an asset on a ledger. They wanted to sell it all, the cattle, the grazing rights, the homestead, to a mining syndicate from the east for a fortune in cash. Silas refused. The ranch was his life, his father's legacy. It was the only thing that mattered. "They tried to reason with me," he said, a bitter smile touching his lips. "Then they tried to threaten me. When that didn't work, they declared me unfit, said I was mad for turning down that kind of money. They tried to have me committed. His escape had been a desperate flight, leaving everything behind. But his brothers were relentless. They couldn't get the full price from the syndicate without his signature on the deed. So they put a price on my head," he concluded, his voice barely a whisper. "Not a wanted poster. Nothing official. Just a private bounty. $5,000 for the man who brings me back, alive or dead. Signing papers is easier if the man holding the pen can't fight back." The pieces clicked into place for Clara. The fine clothes, the ambush that left him wounded, the reason he was left to die. He wasn't just trouble. He was hunted. He was a prize. The men who had left him on that platform weren't just callous. They were bounty hunters who likely thought their job was done. that the heat and his wounds would finish him off. Now, they would know he had survived, and they would come back. Clara stood by the window, staring out into the encroaching darkness. The wind soughed around the corners of the cabin, sounding like a mournful whisper. She could run. She could tell Silas to leave, to take his war somewhere else. The sheriff had all but offered her a way out. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. She thought of the life that awaited her if she chose that path. A train ticket to another town, just like this one. Another set of hardened faces, another lonely room. A life of running away. She turned and looked at Silas. He was watching her, his face etched with exhaustion and a deep, painful vulnerability. He expected her to ask him to leave. It was what anyone else would do. But Clara Bishop was no longer the same woman who had stepped off the train a few weeks ago. That woman was lost, afraid, and alone. This woman had dragged a man from his grave, had stared down death in a fever-ridden room, and had faced the contempt of an entire town. She had invested her own survival in his. His fight had, in some inextricable way, become hers. "They'll come here," she said, her voice steady. It wasn't a question. "They will," he confirmed, his gaze unwavering. "Then we'd best be ready for them," she replied. A look of profound surprise, followed by a slow dawning of something akin to awe, transformed his features. For the first time since she had met him, Silas Mercer looked at her not with gratitude, but with the deep, abiding respect of an equal. The days that followed were charged with a new kind of tension. The quiet intimacy of healing was replaced by the stark focus of preparation. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortification. Their shared purpose forged a new dynamic between them, a partnership born of necessity and sealed by a silent, mutual pact. Silas, though still hampered by his healing side, moved with a rediscovered sense of command. He was a man who understood strategy, who knew the grim calculus of a fight. He took the heavy pistol he'd been carrying, cleaning and oiling its parts with a practiced familiarity that was both reassuring and terrifying to Clara. He showed her how it worked, the weight of the cold steel in her hand a shocking, alien feeling. "You don't aim," he instructed, his voice low and serious as they stood behind the cabin, hidden from the town's view. "You point. Find your target, bring the barrel up, and squeeze. Don't jerk it." She flinched when he fired a single shot into an old log, the explosive crack echoing across the plains. The power of it frightened her, but the fear was secondary to the grim necessity of the lesson. He found a rusty, single-barreled shotgun left behind by a previous tenant, propped in a dark corner. It was old but functional. He spent an afternoon carefully cleaning it, his hands moving with meticulous care. He gave his shotgun to her. "This is yours," he said. "It's simpler. Point and pull. At close range, you can't miss." Clara accepted the weapon, her mind rebelling against the reality it represented. She was a farmer's daughter. Her hands were made for kneading dough, planting seeds, and mending cloth, not for holding a tool of death. Yet, as she practiced loading and unloading the heavy brass shells, a grim resolve settled over her. The world she had known was gone. This new world demanded a different kind of strength, a hardness she hadn't known she possessed. She learned to see her home not as a shelter, but as a battlefield. Silas directed her as they barricaded the single window with the heavy wooden table, leaving just enough of a crack to see through. They reinforced the door with the iron bedstead, creating a brace that would hold against a heavy blow. They rationed their remaining food and, most importantly, their water, filling every available pot and bucket. In the evenings, they would sit in the dim lamplight, the shotgun and pistol lying on the floor between them, a constant, metallic reminder of the coming storm. The silences were different now, no longer filled with tentative curiosity, but with a shared, focused anticipation. He taught her to listen, not just to hear, but to truly listen. To distinguish the sound of the wind from the rustle of a man moving through dry grass. To recognize the distant whinny of a horse that was not a wild stray. During one of these tense evenings, he looked at her, his expression uncharacteristically soft. You should have let me go, Clara, he said quietly. None of this is your fight. She looked down at her hands, no longer soft, but chapped and calloused from chopping wood and hauling water. When I first got here, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I felt like a ghost. Like I had already died and no one had bothered to tell me. Then I saw you on that platform, and everyone just looked away. She finally looked up, meeting his gaze in the flickering light. I guess I just wanted to prove to myself that I could still see, that I wasn't a ghost yet. A profound understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of the brokenness they both carried in the strange, fierce way they were beginning to heal each other. He reached out, his hand covering hers for a brief moment. His touch was warm, solid, a silent promise. When this is over, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not name, I'm not just taking back a ranch, Clara. I'm taking back a life. He didn't have to say that he wanted her to be a part of it. In that moment, she knew. Their alliance was no longer just about survival. It was about building a future on the ashes of their pasts, a future they would have to fight for, together. The wait was the worst part, but they both knew it would not be long. Trouble always found you. The attack came at dusk, the time of day when shadows grew long and treacherous, and the fading light played tricks on the eyes. A lone rider approached the cabin first, bold and unhurried. He didn't try to hide his approach, a clear sign of arrogance. Silas watched him through the crack in the barricaded window, his body tense as a coiled spring. That's Jebediah, he murmured, his voice a low growl. He works for my brothers. A tracker. He's here to confirm I'm the 1-inch. The man circled the cabin once, his eyes lingering on the fortified window and the braced door. He saw the preparations in a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He wheeled his horse around and galloped back toward the low hills, disappearing into the twilight. The scouting was over. The siege was about to begin. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the rider's presence. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the stillness. The shotgun felt slick with sweat in her hands. She was stationed by the hearth, covering the door, while Silas remained at the window, his pistol resting on the sill. There will be 3 of them, Silas said, his voice calm, instructive. Jebediah and 2 others. They won't rush us. They'll try to draw us out, test our nerve. The first shot came without warning. It wasn't aimed at the window, but at the tin chimney pipe on the roof. The loud clang was designed to startle them, to make them panic. Clara jumped, her finger tightening on the trigger. Easy, Silas breathed. Hold your fire. Don't waste a shot until you have a target. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, a voice called out from the darkness, a rough, mocking tone. Mercer, we know you're in there. Your brothers just want to talk. Come on out, and we'll have a drink. Silas didn't answer. The voice called again, this time with more menace. Don't be a fool. We got you boxed in. We can wait all night. Or we can burn you out. The threat hung in the air, thick and oily. Fire was their greatest fear. The small wooden cabin would go up like a tinderbox. Clara's throat went dry. She could smell the kerosene from the lamp, suddenly aware of how flammable their small world was. Then came the sound they had been listening for, a faint scuttling noise from the back of the cabin. They're splitting up, Silas whispered, his eyes still fixed on the front. One of them is trying to back wall. Clara, that's you. Her blood ran cold. She moved silently to the rear wall, pressing her ear against the rough planks. She could hear breathing on the other side, a scratching sound, like a knife trying to find purchase in the wood, trying to pry a board loose. The shotgun was heavy, impossibly heavy. Point and pull, Silas had said. She raised the weapon, the cold metal of the stock pressed against her shoulder. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, picturing the man on the other side. She saw the sneering face of the tracker, the casual cruelty of the town, the indifference that had almost killed them both. A cold, hard fury rose up in her, chasing out the fear. She didn't wait for him to break through. She aimed at the source of the sound, a spot just below where she judged a man's chest would be, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. The shotgun kicked back with brutal force, slamming into her shoulder and sending her staggering backward. A strangled cry of agony from outside was immediately followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the ground. The scratching stopped. A volley of furious gunfire erupted from the front, bullets splintering the door and tearing through the thin walls. "Stay down," Silas roared, returning fire with two quick, precise shots from his pistol. A man screamed in pain. Clara scrambled back to her position by the hearth, her shoulder throbbing, her ears ringing. The smell of gunpowder was thick and acrid. They had bloodied them. The fight was real now. The taunts stopped, replaced by the grim sounds of combat. They could hear the men shouting to each other in the darkness, their confident mockery gone, replaced by anger and desperation. A flaming torch suddenly sailed through the air, landing on the dry porch roof. Flames licked up the shingles instantly. "The roof!" Clara cried, her voice raw with panic. "The water!" Silas yelled, never taking his eyes off the front. "Go!" Without a second thought, she grabbed the largest bucket of water and threw open the door. For a terrifying second, she was completely exposed. A bullet whizzed past her head, so close she felt its heat. She ignored it, heaving the entire contents of the bucket upwards onto the burning porch. The flames sputtered and hissed, dying back with a great plume of steam. She slammed the door shut just as another bullet buried itself in the wood where she had been standing. Her body trembled uncontrollably, but she felt a surge of wild, fierce triumph. She had not flinched. She had not broken. The fight for the cabin, for their lives, raged on into the bloody, violent night. The battle ended as suddenly as it had begun. After Clara had doused the fire, the shooting from outside became sporadic, desperate. Silas's pistol answered each shot with deadly accuracy. There was one last, agonized cry from the darkness, and then a profound, ringing silence. The only sounds were the wind and their own ragged breathing. They waited, every nerve stretched taut, for another attack that never came. The silence held, deep and final. Silas remained at his post by the window for a long time, his pistol held at the ready, his gaze sweeping the darkened landscape. Clara sank to the floor, the heavy shotgun slipping from her nerveless fingers. Her shoulder was a mass of purple bruising, and her body ached with a deep, cellular exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained her drained away, leaving her hollow and trembling. The cabin was a wreck. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, gunpowder, and spilled kerosene. Splintered holes dotted the walls and door, letting in thin slivers of moonlight like accusing fingers. They had held. They had won. Dawn was breaking when Silas finally moved. "It's over," he said, his voice raspy. He unbraced the door and stepped outside, pistol still in hand. Clara followed him, stepping out onto the scorched porch and into the pale, clean light of a new day. The scene was grim. Two bodies lay in the dirt, not 20 feet from the cabin. The third, the one she had shot, was slumped against the back wall. Clara felt a wave of nausea, but she did not look away. This was the cost. This was the reality of the world they now inhabited. Silas checked each of the men, his movements efficient and detached. They were dead. He stood for a long moment, looking down at them, not with triumph, but with a profound and weary sadness. He then walked to their horses, which were tethered nearby, and methodically went through their saddlebags. He found a small, heavy pouch of coins, the bounty money, and a folded, official-looking document. He brought it back to Clara. It was the deed to his family's ranch, the paper his brothers so desperately wanted him to sign. His gaze met hers, and in his eyes, she saw the full weight of what they had just endured and what it had cost him to defy his family. He was bleeding. In the chaos of the fight, she hadn't noticed that a bullet had grazed his arm, tearing through his sleeve and leaving a long, shallow gash. The sight of his blood, fresh and red against his skin, broke through her shock. "You're hurt," she whispered. She led him back inside the ruined cabin, to the small basin of water, and began to clean this new wound. The act was achingly familiar, a mirror of their first days together. But everything was different now. The line between them, of rescuer and patient, of stranger and stranger, had been completely erased by the shared violence of the night. As she bandaged his arm, their hands touched, and this time he did not pull away. He laced his fingers with hers, his grip firm and steady. "Clara," he said, his voice low and hoarse. He didn't need to say more. In his eyes, she saw it all. The gratitude, the respect, the dawning of a love forged in hardship and terror. He stayed for 2 more days, long enough for his new wound to begin healing and for them to set the cabin back to rights as best they could. They worked together in a comfortable silence, boarding up the bullet holes, sweeping up the debris. The bodies of the bounty hunters and the grim task of dealing with them fell to Silas. He loaded them onto their own horses and led them several miles out into the wilderness, returning late in the evening with a grim set to his jaw, saying nothing of what he had done. On the 3rd morning, he stood before her, his saddlebags packed, his pistol once again strapped to his hip. He looked less like the broken man she had found and more like the rancher he had described, strong, determined, and with a purpose burning in his eyes. "I have to go back," he said. "I can't let them win. I can't let them take what my father built, what I love." Clara nodded, her heart a heavy stone in her chest. She had known this moment was coming. His fight wasn't over. It had just begun. "They'll be expecting me to run, to hide," he continued, his gaze intense. "They won't be expecting me to walk through the front door. It's time to end this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the pouch of bounty money. He placed it on the table. "This is yours. It's not enough, not for what you did, but it's a start. Find a safe place, Clara. Go east." By a small plot of land, her eyes stung with tears. After everything, was he just going to leave? To send her away? "I'm not going east," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "My place is here." She looked around the small, battered cabin. It was no longer a prison or a temporary shelter. It was the place where she had found herself. He looked at her, a conflict of emotions warring in his face. Love, fear for her safety, and a deep, aching regret. "It will be dangerous," he warned. "I know," she said simply. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing away her tears. "Then wait for me," he whispered, his voice thick with unspoken promises. "Wait for me right here. When I come back, I'm not coming back alone." He kissed her then, a kiss that was not born of passion, but of a deeper, more profound connection. It was a seal on their pact, a promise of a future yet to be earned. Then he turned, and without looking back, he mounted his horse and rode north, a solitary figure against the vast, open sky, heading home to reclaim his life. Clara remained. The town of redemption, which had once scorned her, now watched her with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. News of the gunfight had spread, whispered in the general store and the saloon. They saw the patched bullet holes in her cabin, the scorched wood on her porch. They saw a woman who had faced down armed men and won. The sheriff kept his distance. No one bothered her. She used some of the money Silas had left to buy proper supplies, a few chickens, and seeds for a small garden. She worked from sunup to sundown, turning the barren patch of land beside the cabin into a small plot of life. The physical labor was healing, grounding. With every weed she pulled, with every seed she planted, she felt herself putting down roots, not into the dry, dusty soil of redemption, but into the new life she had forged for herself. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. Summer bled into the cooler days of autumn. There was no word from Silas. Doubt, a cold and creeping vine, sometimes threatened to choke the hope in her heart. She would stand on her porch in the evenings, staring at the northern horizon until it dissolved into darkness, her resolve wavering. Had he made it? Had his brothers, in their greed and cruelty, finally won? But then she would touch the rough wood of the cabin door, remembering the feel of the shotgun in her hands, the look in Silas's eyes. He had told her to wait, and she would. She was no longer a woman who ran. One afternoon, as the sun was casting long, golden shadows across the land, she saw a dust cloud on the northern trail. It wasn't the small plume of a single rider, but a larger, more significant presence. A wagon, pulled by 2 strong horses and flanked by several outriders. Her heart leaped in her throat. She stood frozen on her porch, her hand instinctively going to the small pistol Silas had left her, tucked into the waistband of her apron. The wagon drew closer, and she could see the man driving it. He was tall and straight, wearing a fine coat and a hat that shaded his face. As he drew nearer still, he removed the hat, and her breath caught in her chest. It was Silas. He was not the gaunt, wounded man she had known. His face was fuller, his shoulders broader. He looked powerful, confident. He looked like he belonged to the land he rode through. He pulled the wagon to a stop before her cabin. He swung down from his seat, his boots landing softly in the dust. He didn't smile, but his eyes, those same clear blue eyes, drank her in, filled with a love and relief so profound it needed no words. "I told you I'd be back," he said, his voice steady and sure. "The ranch is secure. My brothers, they won't be a problem any longer." He didn't elaborate on their fate, and she didn't ask. Some stories didn't need to be told. He gestured to the wagon. It was filled with goods, sacks of flour, crates of supplies, fine bolts of cloth, and a small, sturdy rocking chair strapped to the top. "I brought you some things," he said simply, "but I hope you won't be needing them here for long." He walked up the steps of the porch, closing the distance between them. He stopped before her, his gaze taking in her calloused hands, her sun-weathered face, the quiet strength that radiated from her. "Clara Bishop," he said, his voice softening, "you saved my life, but you did more than that. You show me what a life is worth. It's not about land or money. It's about having something to fight for, someone to come home to." He took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. "Come home with me, Clara. Not as a bride I ordered from a catalog, but as my partner. Come home and build a life with me. Our life." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. She looked from his earnest face to the small, scarred cabin that had been her crucible, her sanctuary, her fortress. It had served its purpose. Her gaze returned to his. She had arrived in redemption, a victim of circumstance, waiting for a life to be given to her. Now, she stood as the architect of her own fate, choosing a life she had earned. "Yes, Silas," she whispered, her voice full of all the hope she thought she had lost. "Yes, I'll come home.